Good evening. From behind our counter at the Forbidden Dispensary, we usually deal in milder poisons. The kind that makes you laugh, the kind that makes you sleep, the kind that turns a bad day soft around the edges. But tonight I'm putting the jars back on the shelf. Tonight I'm turning off the warm lights, because the story we're telling is not cozy. It never was. This is a history of how sickness learned to take orders, not the movie version. Not the clean, glassy lab with a dramatic countdown and a villain in a perfect mask. The real story is older, grayer, more petty, more human. It starts in places that smell like smoke and sweat and stale water. It moves through forts and harbors and offices where men sign papers that feel lighter than the bodies they will eventually weigh. And if you were dropped into most of these scenes, into the tight choke of a siege, into a camp where the latrine leaks downhill, into a ship's belly where the air is damp and shared, you would not last long. Survival was a thin bargain back then. A coin flip, a rumor, a prayer. A cough you could not see coming, so silence whatever is clamoring for your attention. Breathe once, slow and deep. Let the night settle in. We begin where war first realized a city is not just walls. A city is a living arrangement of needs. Stone and timber are only the costume. The real body is water. The real heartbeat is grain. The real spine is the exhausted human routine. Men sleeping stacked close, cooking close, bleeding close, breathing close. Break a wall and you might win the street. Break the water and you unmake the whole place from the inside. Commanders figured that out long before anyone knew what a microbe was. They didn't have lenses. They didn't have cultures growing in dishes. They had smell. They had patterns. They had the ugly arithmetic of watching men fall without a wound. Where people gathered, sickness gathered. It arrived like weather, except it could choose favorites. It could spare the lucky and take the strong. It could step over one bed and claim the next. And because war has always been an imaginative profession, because someone who builds a machine to throw stone will eventually ask what else it can throw, disease began to drift into strategy. Not as science, not at first, more like a superstition you can aim. The old writers were not instruction manuals for cruelty. They were often moralists, recording disasters as warnings. Think of the chroniclers who paused their accounts of battles to describe a plague the way a man pauses a prayer to listen for thunder. One of the most famous, writing about an outbreak in Athens during a brutal war, did not insist that an enemy hurled illness over the walls. He insisted on randomness, on terror, on the way sickness could strip generals down into frightened citizens. And the medical thinkers of that world, those careful observers of air and water and place, had their own explanation. They spoke of foul air, of bad winds, of environments turned rotten by congestion and neglect. Their word was not germs. Their word was something like a curse you could inhale. They could not see the agent, but they could see the conditions that invited it in. Still, siegecraft does not require certainty. It only requires hope. When engineers built devices to launch rocks, they also launched other things. Burning pitch, lime, rotting animals, waste, anything that would contaminate, terrify, demoralize. The goal was often not to spread a specific illness, not in the modern sense. The goal was simpler: foul the well, spoil the food, make every swallow feel like a gamble. And let me tell you something from our side of the counter, from years of watching what people fear. Smell and sight do half the killing before the sickness does the rest. A carcass sailing over a wall does not have to start an epidemic to do damage. It makes the defenders imagine one. It makes them distrust their own water. It makes them look at their bread like it might bite back. It makes them argue. It makes them tired in a deeper way. Sometimes those stories were propaganda too. War has always loved to paint the enemy as filthy, godless, beyond decency. Accusations travel faster than arrows. But some accounts are plausible because the logistics are so small and so nasty. A dead animal is easy to find on a march. A body is never rare in a camp. A well is always a weak point. Yet even then, in the oldest chapters, there was an awkward truth. A besieging army is not separate from the disease it tries to summon. Soldiers sleep in their own filth. They drink from their own streams. They trade lice and coughs like gossip. If you invite rot into the enemy city, you might be inviting it into your own tents. So the moral boundary, what was allowed, what was impious, what would anger the gods, was tangled up with something even colder than ethics. Risk. Some leaders hesitated because they believed in decency. Some hesitated because they believed in consequence. And sometimes desperation shoved both beliefs aside and wrote the final order anyway. Archaeology, centuries later, makes the story more complicated and more honest. Mass graves with the mark of sudden death are not always battle graves. They can be plague pits, they can be hunger pits. They can be the quiet record of a siege that squeezed a city until illness took over. And the newer sciences, those that pull ancient traces from teeth and bone, have taught us something eerie. Pathogens have been with us longer than our favorite medieval stories ever guessed. Traces of the plague bacterium have been found in places far older than the classic pandemic narratives. That does not prove weaponization. It proves presence. It proves that the enemy has always been in the room with us, whether we acknowledged it or not. That's the trouble with history when you look closely. Intentionality is slippery. A city can die because an enemy poisoned a well. A city can die because 1,000 frightened people crowded together behind walls and did what frightened people do: breathed the same air until the air became dangerous. And sometimes the record cannot tell you which it was. Sometimes it was both, braided together so tightly you cannot separate the strands. But there is one medieval scene that refuses to stay vague, one image so vivid it has survived for centuries like a stain that will not lift. A city on the edge of trade routes, a siege, a plague, and bodies thrown like ammunition. They call it the Siege of Caffa. Picture it, a fortified trading colony on the Crimean coast, perched where caravan roads and sea lanes meet. A hinged city, a place where commerce moved like blood. The besieging force was not merely a mob, but an organized army tied into a vast steppe empire. Then plague struck the camp outside the walls, and a later chronicler, writing with the clean moral certainty of a man who wants calamity to have a culprit, described the attackers launching infected corpses into the city. It is a perfect story in the worst sense. It has a weapon, it has a victim, it has agency, it turns catastrophe into intention, and because it is perfect, historians have argued over it for a long time. Could fleas on bodies have helped spread plague? Possibly. Could the act have contaminated water and worsened conditions? Certainly, but the deeper engine of that pandemic, what later generations would call the Black Death, was trade itself. Rodents, fleas, ships and caravans moving through ports and markets, carrying more than silk and spice. Still, the Caffa story matters even if it was only partly true, because it marks a shift in imagination, a mental step, a new way of thinking. A city could be infected the way it could be starved. And once humans imagine a tactic, it tends to return. The world grew more connected, ships crossed oceans, empires stretched their hands into places they did not understand. And along with steel and scripture came diseases that were not planned, not aimed like arrows, but arrived as stowaways. In the years after the first Atlantic crossings, European illnesses tore through indigenous communities in the Americas with a speed that still feels unreal when you read it. Smallpox, measles, influenza. Not because the people were weak, but because they had never met these enemies before. No immunological memory, no inherited familiarity, just a sudden collision with invisible blades. Entire social structures buckled, leadership collapsed, farming cycles broke. The living gathered into new patterns, sometimes forced, sometimes chosen, and those new patterns often made contagion worse. And when conquerors arrived, they often stepped into a world already cracked by disease. It would be too simple and too self-serving to say sickness conquered empires alone. Disease does not hold a sword, but it removes the margin that makes resistance possible. It empties the pool of fighters. It steals planners and healers and elders. It turns a society's spare strength into funeral labor. Further south in the Andean world, similar timing turned tragedy into opportunity for invaders. Illness arrived ahead of conquest, killed a ruler, and helped spark internal conflict. When foreign soldiers finally appeared, they found an empire already frayed by grief and succession and civil war, with sickness woven into the fabric like rot in a beam. Most of that devastation was not deliberate. It was the violence of accident, the cruelty of biology paired with conquest and movement. But there are moments, documented moments, when intent crawls out from behind the curtain and admits itself in ink. And that is where we will go next. Because there is a fort in North America, there are blankets in a record book, and there are letters between officers that read like calm handwriting over a scream. We'll open that drawer in part 2. For now, from the Forbidden Dispensary, I'll leave you with the first truth of this long story. Disease did not become a weapon because it is clever. It became a weapon because people are, and people have always been willing to try the cheapest thing that might work. Good night for the moment. We left off at the point where accident begins to look like policy, because for all the centuries where disease hovered around war like smoke, sometimes guided, sometimes merely endured, there comes a moment in the archive that feels different. Not myth, not moral rumor, not a chronicler trying to give the universe a villain. Paperwork, a fort, a journal entry, a polite meeting where men speak as if they're discussing trade, while something far worse sits folded in their hands like cloth. We arrive in the year 1763, in the aftermath of a war that rearranged North America's balance of power. Britain had pushed France out of key territories and took control of forts that had once been French anchors. But the land was not empty. It was not waiting. Indigenous confederacies, facing a tightening ring of encroachment and broken understandings, rose in resistance. Conflicts now grouped under the name of Pontiac's War. In that tense landscape stood Fort Pitt, where modern Pittsburgh now sits. British soldiers inside a palisaded position, indigenous forces outside, negotiations, threats, raids, and the constant pressure of siege logic, food, water, endurance, fear. Then comes the meeting in June. A British officer records in his journal that he gave 2 blankets and a handkerchief from the smallpox hospital to indigenous visitors. He writes it down like a supply note, like a minor transaction. That line is one of those bones history catches in its throat, because it does not shout, it does not justify itself, it simply exists. And around the same time, higher-level correspondence moves across desks, a colder kind of evidence. Geoffrey Amherst, commanding British forces in North America, writes to Colonel Henry Bouquet with a question that should have died in the mind that formed it: whether it might be possible to send the smallpox among indigenous people. Bouquet replies in the same tone men use when discussing transport schedules. He says he will attempt it. He mentions infected items. He frames it as method. No demon masks, no theatrical villainy, just bureaucratic calm. This is one of the clearest documented expressions in the English language record of intent to use contagious disease as a tool of war. Historians argue details, as they should. They ask whether the blankets at Fort Pitt were truly effective, whether outbreaks would have happened regardless, whether disease ecology had already set the stage. Those questions matter, but the moral stain does not depend on measurable success. The stain is in the willingness, the intent. The fact that men with authority looked at smallpox, not as tragedy to survive, not as danger to contain, but as leverage. And that's a theme you will see again and again as knowledge grows sharper. The more clearly humans understand disease, the more tempting it becomes to aim it. Even in the 18th century, people had a rough concept of immunity. Inoculation existed in various forms across Eurasia, and British officers knew of it. They understood, imperfectly, that exposure could produce protection. That knowledge, crude as it was, created a dark possibility. If you can guard your own side, you might dare to harm the other. War loves asymmetry. It loves anything that saves your men while breaking theirs. But disease is not a musket. It does not respect uniforms. It travels through air and touch and fear. So even the planners who dreamed of infection had to live with uncertainty. A weapon that might drift back into your own camp is not a clean tool. It's a gamble with teeth. Still, the archive shows the thought occurred, and the thought was given permission to live on paper. It is worth saying, because accuracy matters, that many other colonial-era allegations about deliberate infection are harder to prove. There are claims about contaminated items in earlier centuries. Some are based on later retellings, on rumor, on community memory recorded decades after the events. Those accounts should not be dismissed out of hand, but they demand careful handling. Fort Pitt is different because the documentation is direct, and what surrounds Fort Pitt is a larger, more common truth. In the Americas, the catastrophic role of disease in conquest was overwhelmingly unintentional introduction paired with brutal policy choices that made outbreaks deadlier. That distinction matters. It does not soften the horror. It clarifies responsibility. Because even where contagion was accidental, the colonial system often took the devastation and treated it like opportunity. Labor shortages fueled forced labor and expanded enslavement. Mission towns and relocations concentrated survivors into conditions where disease spread more efficiently. Disrupted agriculture led to malnutrition, and malnutrition made every infection more lethal. Policy became an accelerant. This is one reason the old moral question, did they mean it, can sometimes distract from the more practical question. What did they do once they saw what was happening? Now, as the centuries turn and the world tightens into global trade, the story shifts again. Disease stops being merely something soldiers stumble into. It becomes something governments start to study, not with pity, with budgets. The long arc of the 19th century is often told as a triumph story. Microscopes, germ theory, vaccination, antiseptic surgery, clean water, lives saved at scale, and all of that is true. But the same knowledge that teaches a doctor how to prevent death also teaches a general how death might be manufactured. Edward Jenner, in the year 1796, finds a way to protect a child against smallpox using cowpox. A simple observation becomes a revolution. Then physicians and reformers push for hand-washing, sanitation, and safer hospitals. John Snow traces cholera to a water pump and changes how cities think about water. Louis Pasteur proves contamination is not magic, and Robert Koch isolates microbes and builds rules for identifying them. Science begins to see what no one could see before. It names the invisible. And once you can name it, you can cultivate it. The laboratory grows into a new kind of fortress. Culture plates appear like tiny fields where death can be farmed. Institutes and universities become training grounds not only for medicine, but for administration and empire. Colonial powers build labs in tropical stations because they need their troops and workers alive. Public health becomes logistics. And when something becomes logistics, war planners notice. By the time the world stumbles into the First World War, armies are not just masses of men. They are supply chains, they are systems. And those systems depend heavily on animals, horses, mules, cattle. Break the animals and you break the movement of guns and food. Disease becomes a strategic vulnerability. In that war, biological sabotage stops being just rumor and becomes, at least in certain documented cases, deliberate action. There is an early modern figure in this story, an operative working for German intelligence, linked to schemes involving glanders, a disease deadly to horses and dangerous to humans. The method was not dramatic. It was mundane, which is always the most unsettling part. Contaminated feed, infected equipment, routine handling turned into delivery, no explosions, no spectacle, just animals sickening, dying, being condemned, and the ripple of disruption spreading through supply schedules. That is what biological harm often looks like in practice. Quiet damage to the machinery of daily life. And as war ministries professionalize their medical corps, as vaccines become standard, As quarantine rules tighten and labs become part of military infrastructure, a new arithmetic settles into place. If we can defend ourselves from disease, can we use it? This is where we're headed next, because once the 20th century opens its doors, it does not stop at sabotage, it industrializes. The next parts will take us through the uneasy years of treaties that promise restraint while laboratories stay busy behind closed doors. It will take us to the most systematic atrocity of biological weaponization in wartime. Imperial Japan's program, the place history remembers by a number. And it will take us to the Cold War, where secrecy became its own climate and biology learned to live inside it. That's part 3. For now, sit with the image of those blankets, sitting in the record like a dry leaf pressed into a book. Sit with the fact that the most chilling things humans do are often written down plainly, because the men doing them believe they are reasonable. From the Forbidden Dispensary, that's tonight's measure. When a government learns how something works, it almost always asks the same question twice. First, how do we stop this from happening to us? Second, how do we make it happen to them? In the 19th century, the first question wore a clean coat. It sounded like hospitals and soap and safe water. It sounded like a doctor leaning over a child and refusing to accept that death was simply part of the weather. Edward Jenner's work in the year 1796 gave the modern world a hinge. Cowpox could protect against smallpox. A generation later, physicians began to fight hospital death itself. Ignaz Semmelweis pushing hand-washing in Vienna, John Snow mapping cholera to a pump in London, Louis Pasteur demonstrating that life does not appear from nothing, Robert Koch isolating microbes and proposing methods to prove what caused what. By the time the century turned, the invisible had been given names, and once something is named, it can be collected. Once it can be collected, it can be stored. Once it can be stored, it can be counted, and anything that can be counted can be placed on a ledger. And anything that can be placed on a ledger can become an item in a budget, and anything that becomes a budget item can become a tool. That is the quiet road from public health to weapon science. It does not arrive with trumpets. It arrives with funding requests, staffing charts, and laboratories built behind fences. During the First World War, the official story most countries told their citizens was that disease was the enemy inside the trenches. Typhus, dysentery, influenza, and the endless infections that bloom when men live in mud and fear. Militaries responded with sanitation, inoculation, and quarantine measures. They built medical corps and bacteriology units because armies that cannot control disease cannot fight. But the war also offered another lesson. Modern conflict is logistics, and logistics has soft spots. Horses and mules moved artillery. Cattle and food animals mattered for supply. If you could hit the enemy's animal transport, you could slow his guns without firing at his soldiers. That temptation produced acts of sabotage, quiet, practical, hard to prove at the time, but threaded through archives and later investigations. Biological harm in these early modern episodes was rarely about dramatic mass death. It was about disruption, and disruption is often cheaper than battle. The interwar period tried to put a lid on the worst ideas. After chemical weapons haunted the memory of the Great War, diplomats and lawyers began to talk about restraint. The Geneva Protocol, signed in the year 1925, prohibited the use of chemical weapons and also bacteriological methods of warfare. The phrasing matters. It outlawed use. It did not truly outlaw preparation. So states could sign with one hand and research with the other, telling themselves that what they were doing was defensive. The line between defense and offense in biology has always been thin enough to slide a knife through. You build vaccines to protect your troops, so you also learn how the organism behaves. You develop detection systems, so you also learn what a successful release would look like. You study aerosol spread for safety, so you also learn how to optimize dissemination. It's the same science, the same tools, different intent. And then the Second World War arrives, and intent stops being a philosophical argument. It becomes a factory problem. The most systematic and shameful biological warfare program of that era did not come out of Europe's famous laboratories. It came out of Imperial Japan's occupied territories in East Asia, where conquest and secrecy created the conditions for a kind of research that should never have been possible. History remembers it as Unit 731. Officially, it was a department for epidemic prevention and water purification. Words meant to sound sanitary, even benevolent. In reality, it was an apparatus built for weaponization and for human experimentation, on a scale that makes the stomach clench even when you've read too much already. Its architect was Shiro Ishii, a military physician and bacteriologist who understood two truths. Modern states would pay for science, and modern wars would reward cruelty if it could be made useful. He cultivated support. He secured funding. He built facilities in Pingfang near Harbin, laboratories, production sites, insect breeding rooms, and the machinery to turn pathogens into munitions. The victims were not numbers, though the program tried to turn them into numbers. Prisoners of war, civilians, political captives, men, women, and children. In the unit's internal euphemism, they were logs. Not patients, not people. Raw material. They were infected deliberately with diseases like plague, anthrax, cholera, typhoid, and others. They were observed as illness progressed. Many were subjected to vivisection without anesthesia, because the researchers wanted the body's reactions uncontaminated by mercy. Frostbite experiments were conducted in cold chambers. Limbs were frozen, thawed, inspected like broken tools. Field trials followed, because war labs are rarely satisfied with theory. Vectors were bred, fleas as delivery systems. Contaminated materials were released in rural areas. Wells and waterways were targeted. The aim was not just to see if infection could happen, but to see whether it could happen predictably enough to be called a weapon. The exact number of victims is contested for reasons that are both technical and political. Records were destroyed, survivors were silenced. Post-war governments had reasons to emphasize or minimize certain figures. But what matters is not the arithmetic alone. What matters is that it happened, and it was systematic. Unit 731 was not an accident. It was a state-backed program. And when the war ended, the world's moral accounting did not land evenly. The Soviets captured some personnel and held trials in Khabarovsk, bringing evidence into public view. But American occupation authorities made a different decision. In exchange for data, key figures received immunity. Knowledge was treated like spoils. Suffering was treated like currency. It is one of the ugliest bargains in modern scientific history, a deal that implied results mattered more than crimes, so long as the results were useful. That bargain helped seed the Cold War's biological anxiety, because now everyone knew the same thing, even if they pretended not to. Biology could be industrialized as a weapon. Not easily, not casually, but with enough funding and secrecy, yes. And secrecy is something the Cold War had in endless supply. So after 1945, the laboratories did not disappear. They changed their signage. They reworded their mission statements. They leaned into defense, even when defense required learning the offensive craft well enough to fear it. In Britain, Porton Down expanded research under the pressure of wartime experience. In the United States, a facility in Maryland, first called Camp Detrick and later Fort Detrick, became a central node in American biological research. There were plans that sound like dark jokes until you realize they were considered seriously. Tests on islands, studies of spores that could survive storage and travel, ideas about targeting livestock to collapse food supplies. The research wasn't always used, but it existed, and the existence is the point. Because a weapon you never deploy can still shape the world. It shapes budgets, it shapes paranoia, it shapes retaliation logic. It shapes what leaders believe the enemy might do. That is how the Cold War turns biology into an atmosphere. In the next part, we're going to step into that atmosphere properly. We'll talk about how treaties tried to ban what labs kept quietly studying. We'll talk about the Soviet program that defectors later described as enormous, an industrial network hidden behind civilian front doors. We'll talk about an anthrax accident that tore a hole in the official story and let the truth leak out like a plume. From the Forbidden Dispensary, this is where the history stops being ancient siegecraft and becomes modern statecraft. The kind that smiles for cameras while keeping cultures growing behind locked doors. That's part 4. By the time the Second World War ended, the world had learned a bitter lesson. You can outlaw a weapon in public and still keep it alive in private. Treaties are paper, laboratories are infrastructure. And infrastructure, once built, rarely disappears. It repurposes, it relabels, it waits. In the years after victory, nations talked about peace the way people talk about sleep, as if naming it might summon it. But the new era, the Cold War, was not restful. It was vigilance as policy. Suspicion as a daily habit. 2 blocks staring at each other across maps and trying to calculate what the other side could do in secret. Biology fit that era perfectly, because it is inherently dual use. The same fermenter that can grow vaccine can grow something else. The same aerosol study that can help design respirators can also help design dispersion. The same training that teaches a young microbiologist how to prevent outbreaks also teaches them what an outbreak needs in order to spread. So governments did what governments always do in an age of fear. They invested. Publicly, much of the language was defensive. Detection systems, protective gear, vaccines and stockpiles. Just in case. But defense in this domain often requires learning the offensive shape so well that you could mirror it if you chose. In Britain, Porton Down continued as a nerve center for chemical and biological research, wrapped in secrecy and justified as necessity. In the United States, Fort Detrick became a major hub. On paper, these programs were about protection. In practice, they also preserved capabilities and knowledge that made protection credible in a world where deterrence meant the ability to respond. There were open-air tests too. Some acknowledged later, some discovered the way uncomfortable truths often are. By investigative persistence, by declassification, by lawsuits, by the slow grind of people refusing to accept silence, cities were exposed to simulants, organisms officials described as harmless, to study dispersal patterns. This was sold as safety research, learning how a biological agent might move through streets and air currents. But to the public, when the truth surfaced, it landed differently. People don't like being used as terrain. Even when the intent is research, even when the agent is believed safe, the act of release becomes a betrayal of trust. And trust, once cracked, makes every later public health message harder to deliver. But as unsettling as those Western programs were, the most significant Cold War biological story, the one that later rattled diplomats and scientists alike, unfolded behind the Iron Curtain. The Soviet Union signed the Biological Weapons Convention in the early 1970s, presenting itself as a responsible member of an international order. And then, according to a growing body of evidence that emerged after the Cold War's seams began to split, it continued and expanded an offensive biological weapons program on an immense scale. The name that came to be associated with this apparatus was biopreparat. It sounded civilian, it sounded medical, it sounded like vaccine production and public health. That was the point. Defectors and later investigations described a network that involved dozens of institutes and a workforce numbering in the tens of thousands. A system designed not merely to tinker with pathogens, but to industrialize them, to produce them in quantities that fit military planning. They spoke of strains optimized for aerosol spread, of research into antibiotic resistance, of the exploration of pathogens that in a saner world would never have been framed as deliverable assets. One of the most chilling claims was that Soviet researchers explored weaponization of smallpox even after the world celebrated smallpox eradication, declared by the World Health Organization in the year 1980. The idea that a disease removed from nature might be kept alive in secrecy as a weapon is the kind of thought that makes treaties feel suddenly fragile. Not because the treaty text is unclear, but because trust is. And then there was Sverdlovsk. In the year 1979, in a Soviet city now known as Yekaterinburg, an outbreak of anthrax killed dozens. The official story blamed contaminated meat. That explanation might have been plausible in a different context. Anthrax can spread through livestock, but patterns have their own stubborn voice. Years later, researchers and investigators, working with maps and patient histories, argued that the distribution of cases made more sense as an airborne plume drifting from a military facility than as a foodborne outbreak. The bodies had told a spatial story the state did not want told. Eventually, after the Soviet Union began to crack open, an admission came. Not a full confession in the language of guilt, but an acknowledgement that the outbreak was tied to an accident at a military microbiology site. An aerosol release. A mistake. And that is another constant in this history. Biological weapons do not only threaten enemies, they threaten their owners. They sit in vats and freezers and filtration systems that rely on human perfection, and humans are not perfect. A dropped procedure, a missing filter, an exhausted technician. Sometimes that is all it takes to turn secrecy into tragedy. Sverdlovsk became a kind of proof by wound. It demonstrated that a state could maintain illegal biological capacity while claiming compliance, and it demonstrated that accidents in such programs are not theoretical. They are funerals. Meanwhile, in the West, the United States made a highly public move. In the year 1969, President Richard Nixon announced that the United States would renounce offensive biological weapons. It was widely praised, and it did lead to the dismantling of certain stockpiles and programs. But renunciation does not erase knowledge, it does not erase facilities, it does not erase the logic of deterrence. Defensive work continued, and defensive work, again, has edges that can look offensive depending on who is looking and what they fear. This is the problem treaties kept running into. Biology does not behave like a missile silo. You cannot easily count it from space. You cannot easily inspect it without walking into places that also produce legitimate medicines, vaccines, and research. Verification in biology is a technical nightmare because so many tools are common, so many purposes overlap. A fermenter can be innocent or criminal depending on what is inside it and why. That brings us to the Biological Weapons Convention, opened for signature in the year 1972 and entering into force in the year 1975. This treaty went further than the Geneva Protocol. It prohibited development, production, stockpiling, and acquisition of biological and toxin weapons, except in quantities justified for peaceful purposes like protection and research. It was, on paper, a major moral achievement, but it carried a weakness that still matters. It lacked a robust verification mechanism. No standing inspectorate with the authority and technical capacity to walk into facilities at will and confirm compliance the way chemical weapons treaties later attempted. In practice, this meant the treaty relied on norms, trust, and diplomacy, on the hope that shame and international pressure would deter cheating. Sverdlovsk and the later biopreparat revelations suggested that hope was not enough. Then another shock arrived, this time from a different direction. After the Gulf War, United Nations inspections in Iraq revealed that Saddam Hussein's regime had pursued a clandestine biological weapons program, one that had cultivated agents and sought weaponization undercover. The discovery mattered not only because of Iraq itself, but because it showed how easily a determined state could exploit the treaty's lack of verification. This did not mean every state was cheating. It meant the system could be cheated. And once the possibility becomes real, paranoia blooms. Diplomats spent years trying to negotiate a verification protocol that could strengthen the convention. Scientists, industry leaders, and security services argued over what inspections would mean, whether they would catch cheaters or simply expose sensitive research and commercial secrets. In the year 2001, the United States rejected a draft protocol, arguing it would not be effective and could compromise national security and proprietary information. That decision fractured momentum and left the treaty still standing, still important, still morally necessary, but structurally limited. So by the end of the 20th century, the world had a strange arrangement. a strong norm on paper, enormous scientific capacity in reality, and no foolproof way to prove who was honest without intrusive access, few were willing to grant. That is the Cold War legacy in this domain. Not just programs and accidents, but a lingering verification problem that modern biology keeps making harder. Because the tools keep getting cheaper, the knowledge keeps spreading, the line between state and non-state capability keeps thinning. Which is where we go next. In Part 5, we step away from superpowers and into domestic spaces. We talk about the first major documented biological attack in the United States, carried out not by a government, but by a cult with a political goal. We talk about Japan again, but in a different guise. Aum Shinrikyo, whose biological ambitions failed, while their chemical terror succeeded. And we talk about letters filled with anthrax spores that turned American mail into a source of dread. From the Forbidden Dispensary, this is the point where the story stops being only about what states do in secrecy and becomes about what individuals and groups can do in plain sight. That's Part 5. A certain kind of person likes to think biological terror is too technical for small hands. They imagine it requires a state, a uniform, a budget line buried in classified paperwork, a facility that hums behind fences. They imagine it takes generals and laboratories and the cold patience of bureaucracy. Sometimes it does, but the modern chapter that unsettles people the most is the one that happens in places that feel ordinary. Restaurants, subway cars, mailrooms, places where the social contract is supposed to do its quiet work. Places built on trust. In the year 1984, in Wasco County, Oregon, a strange outbreak begins to bloom. Foodborne illness, the kind that usually gets blamed on undercooked meat, dirty hands, a kitchen that cut corners. People get sick, then more people, then hundreds. It wasn't an accident. Members of the Rajneeshi commune, followers of Bhagwan Sri Rajneesh, operating under the direction of Ma Anand Sheela, had a plan that was ugly in its simplicity. They wanted to influence a local election. They wanted to suppress turnout by making people too sick to show up. So they deliberately contaminated food. They used salmonella. They targeted multiple restaurants and public spaces. And in the end, hundreds fell ill. Estimates often circle around the idea of roughly 750 sickened. There were no confirmed fatalities, and that fact has sometimes made people talk about it as if it were a crude prank. It was not a prank, it was a proof. A biological attack does not need to kill to be a weapon. It can incapacitate, it can strain clinics, it can spread fear, it can change behavior, it can alter politics. And the Oregon case taught public health and law enforcement something they had been slow to accept. Not every biological threat wears a flag. Sometimes it wears a smile and walks into a kitchen. The Rajneeshi incident also highlighted a low, persistent truth about biological harm. The easiest path is often not aerosolization, not engineered superbugs, not cinematic plagues. The easiest path is contamination of food and water. It is access, not genius. A person who can reach the salad bar can do damage. That case ended in investigations, prosecutions, and a hardening of awareness. The idea of bioterrorism stopped being a theoretical military concern and became a domestic security issue with public health at its center. Then Japan offered a darker lesson. Aum Shinrikyo was not a small group improvising in a kitchen. It was a wealthy, apocalyptic cult that tried to build capabilities that looked uncomfortably like state ambitions. They recruited educated members. They built laboratories. They pursued both chemical and biological agents, driven by a belief system that treated mass death as prophecy. Through the early 1990s, the group attempted to deploy biological agents, including efforts involving botulinum toxin and what they believed to be anthrax. But their biological attempts largely failed. Their strains were weak or unsuitable. Their delivery methods were clumsy. Their technical competence was not enough to make the biology cooperate. Some people heard that and drew the wrong comfort. They concluded that bioterrorism was too hard. The better lesson is narrower and colder. Effective biological attack requires sustained expertise, good material, and reliable delivery. And groups that lack those things may switch to methods they can execute. Aum did. In the year 1995, they released sarin gas in the Tokyo subway. The attack killed and injured many, and it shattered Japan's sense of safety in public space. It also left the world with a blunt warning. When a group is determined, it will search for the path of least technical resistance to achieve maximum fear. Aum's leadership was eventually arrested and prosecuted. Years later, Shoko Asahara and other senior figures were executed. The trials and their aftermath left a long shadow over how Japan thinks about extremist groups, scientific access, and the fragile boundary between open society and security. Then, in the United States, fear arrived in an envelope. In the year 2001, in the weeks after the attacks of September, letters containing anthrax spores were mailed to media outlets and to United States senators, including Tom Daschle and Patrick Leahy. The effect was immediate and disproportionate, not only because people became ill, but because mail itself, one of the quiet circulatory systems of civic life, became suspect. In total, more than 20 people were infected. Several developed inhalational anthrax, and several died. Postal workers were among the most exposed. Facilities shut down. Buildings were evacuated. Tens of thousands took antibiotics as a precaution. White powder, something once associated with office boredom, became a trigger for emergency response. This was not mass casualty warfare in the classic sense. This was targeted terror with a wide psychological blast radius. And the investigation, known widely as Amerithrax, became one of the most sprawling and controversial in modern American law enforcement history. For years, the case moved through wrong leads, public suspicion, and institutional pressure to produce an answer. A man was wrongly accused in the public imagination and later compensated, but damage does not rewind neatly. Eventually, the investigation focused on a scientist at Fort Detrick, Bruce Ivins. He died by suicide before trial, and the government later announced it believed he acted alone. Critics and observers continued to dispute aspects of the evidence and process, leaving the case with a residue of unresolved doubt for some. That residue matters because of what attribution means in biological incidents. If you cannot say, credibly and publicly, who did it, then fear multiplies. Suspicion spreads. And the next emergency becomes harder to manage because the public begins to believe no one is in control, no one is honest, and no one is accountable. Out of the anthrax mailings came laws and programs. The United States tightened select agent controls. Shipping and storage rules became stricter. Funding flowed into medical countermeasures. Stockpiles expanded. Public health and law enforcement built new protocols for joint response, because in biological incidents, the first responders are often doctors, not police. The deeper change was cultural. Biology became part of homeland security thinking. But every security move has a shadow. Regulation can slow research. Overclassification can prevent information sharing. Public fear can turn into mistrust of science itself. And mistrust, in a pandemic or an attack, is a lethal amplifier. So this modern chapter offers a strange paired lesson. First, the barrier to certain kinds of biological harm is lower than people want to believe, especially when the target is food, water, or trust. Second, the barrier to reliable, large-scale biological mass casualty attack is still significant, requiring expertise, quality material, and delivery methods that are not trivial. That is not reassurance. It is an engineering assessment of risk. Now, as if the world needed more complexity, another problem rose to the surface: dual-use science. The same technologies that speed cures can also speed misuse. Genetics became cheaper, sequencing became fast, gene editing became precise. The gap between information and organism narrowed. So the question shifted again, not only who might attack, but also what should we publish, build, and share? In Part 6, we move into that dilemma. We talk about how modern genomics and gene editing complicated the boundary between peaceful research and dangerous capability. We talk about scientific debates over publishing methods that increase transmissibility. We talk about self-policing in industry, oversight frameworks, and the uneasy truth that you cannot uninvent knowledge. From the Forbidden Dispensary, this is where the story stops looking like spycraft and starts looking like a university lab. Bright lights, grant proposals, ethical committees, and the uncomfortable awareness that sometimes the most dangerous things are done with the best intentions. That's part 6 from the Forbidden Dispensary. There is a moment in every long story where the monster stops living in a distant castle and starts living in the town. Not because it moved, but because you finally understand what it is made of. For biological weapons, that moment is modern biology itself, the era when life became editable, readable, and increasingly buildable. When a pathogen stopped being only a thing you might stumble upon in a swamp or a camp, and became, in principle, something you could describe as information. Once disease is information, it travels at the speed of copying. The late 20th century and the early 21st did not just expand laboratories, they expanded access. Sequencing got cheaper, computing got stronger. Techniques that once belonged to elite institutions began to appear in more hands, more countries, more private companies. The world built a new biology industry, mostly for good reasons, mostly for healing, mostly for profit that can be justified by the healing. But you cannot separate the good reasons from the capacities. In the year 2002, a landmark experiment rattled people who had been comforting themselves with the idea that certain pathogens were out of reach. Researchers demonstrated that a virus could be assembled from published genetic sequence data and commercially available DNA fragments. The point was not to announce a doomsday. The point was to demonstrate a principle. The distance between we know the sequence and we can make the organism was shrinking. Then the pace accelerated. Sequencing, reading genetic code, became fast and cheap enough to be routine. Editing became more precise. And in the year 2012, a tool rose into wide awareness that made even seasoned scientists sit up straighter. CRISPR, a system that allows targeted genetic changes with a simplicity and accessibility that earlier generations would have considered almost absurd. This is where the story becomes ethically cramped, because almost every major biomedical advance is dual use by nature. Vaccines can be used to protect troops, yes, but the underlying work teaches what immunity can be bypassed. Gene editing can cure inherited diseases, but it can also alter a pathogen. Synthetic biology can create life-saving manufacturing platforms, and it can also shorten the timeline for producing harmful agents. This is not a conspiracy. It is the physics of capability. So the question becomes, how do you govern knowledge that is meant to be shared? Science is built on publication, transparency, replication, peer review. The habit of putting methods into the open so others can test and improve them. Public health depends on rapid sharing, sequences, case reports, lab findings, outbreak intelligence. But security depends on limiting certain information. And when those values collide, you get a fight that feels like a moral civil war inside the scientific community. One of the most famous modern flashpoints arrived in the early 2010s, when researchers conducted experiments that increased the ability of a highly lethal avian influenza virus to spread between mammals under laboratory conditions. The details set off alarms. The debate was not only about the science, it was about publishing the methods. If the work was published in full, some argued, it could act like a blueprint for misuse. If it was not published, others argued, it would cripple preparedness and set a precedent for censorship that could backfire, driving risky work underground or delaying legitimate defensive progress. For a while, there were calls for redaction, for partial publication, then revisions, further review, and eventual publication. The controversy did not end. It simply matured into a permanent tension. This is the modern dilemma. Openness saves lives, and openness can also endanger them. Governments responded with oversight frameworks, advisory boards, policies for dual-use research of concern, a term that sounds tidy until you realize how messy its edges are. What qualifies as concern? Who decides? How do you enforce oversight across borders when science is global and funding, publication, and talent move internationally? Some countries built strong review mechanisms. Others built softer ones. Some relied on professional norms, hoping scientists would self-police. Industry tried to create guardrails too. Gene synthesis companies developed screening practices to flag orders associated with regulated pathogens or suspicious sequences. Trade groups established voluntary standards. Voluntary standards help, but they are uneven. Not every company belongs to a trade group. Not every country has the same regulatory culture. And a determined actor can shop for the weakest link. So governance became a layered web. Laws, norms, institutional review boards, journal policies, export controls, and professional ethics training. None of it is perfect. It is more like a fence made of different materials, built quickly because the alternative is leaving the yard open. There is a practical reason verification remains hard in this domain. Biology is not rare the way nuclear material is rare. The equipment is common. The organisms in many cases are part of nature. The knowledge is widely taught. A high-containment lab can be used for legitimate vaccine research or for something else, and from the outside, the difference can be invisible. This is why the Biological Weapons Convention, though morally powerful, remains operationally limited. It prohibits hostile development and stockpiling, but it cannot easily prove compliance through routine inspection without colliding with legitimate secrecy, proprietary research, and national security concerns. The result is a world where much of safety depends on three things that are hard to legislate. First, competence. Labs that work with dangerous organisms must be run by people who understand risk deeply. Second, culture. Safety must be a habit, not a checkbox. Whistleblowing must be possible. Oversight must be real. Third, trust. Between scientists and regulators, between nations, between the public and institutions. And trust is fragile. That fragility matters because response, the ability to blunt harm once something begins, depends on public cooperation. People must believe the guidance. They must accept vaccines, isolation measures, treatment protocols. If they believe the authorities are lying, or if they believe science is just another instrument of power, then even the best countermeasures falter. So modern biological security is not only about locks and cameras. It is about maintaining legitimacy. This is also where the science gets tangled with the speed of modern life. Information moves faster than committees. A genome can be uploaded in minutes. A method can be replicated across continents. A preprint can spread before a journal has time to decide what it thinks about the risk. That doesn't mean we should throttle science into silence. It means the systems for weighing risk have to move faster and more intelligently than they did in an earlier era. And it means something else too, that preparedness must be built as if prevention will fail sometimes, because it will. In Part 7, we move into the practical side of that preparedness. Not the dramatic fantasies, but the real work. Surveillance in clinics, lab networks, forensic microbiology, stockpiles, vaccine platforms, and the quiet machinery that decides whether an outbreak becomes a crisis. We'll talk about how detection works, how attribution is attempted, and why many high-tech solutions are less reliable than the boring ones. Trained people, clear reporting, and the capacity to act quickly. From the Forbidden Dispensary, this is the uncomfortable hinge of the modern era. We cannot uninvent the tools, and we cannot rely only on banning them. We have to build systems sturdy enough to survive misuse, accident, and nature's own indifference. That's Part 7. Preparedness is not a gadget. It is not a single sensor on a rooftop, not a glossy plan in a binder, not a press conference where someone promises the situation is under control. Preparedness is a habit of seeing early, deciding clearly, and moving fast, while everyone else is still arguing about whether the smoke is real. And in biological events, the first smoke signal is almost always clinical. A doctor noticing something odd, a nurse seeing a pattern. Two patients with the same strange pneumonia, the same rash, the same timing, the same story. This is the oldest surveillance system on Earth: human attention. Modern governments tried to mechanize that attention. They built syndromic surveillance systems that watch emergency room visits, lab test requests, pharmacy purchases, school absenteeism, any signal that might suggest sickness is rising before the hospitals are overwhelmed. The idea is simple. If you can spot the curve early, you can blunt it. But the curve only tells you that something is happening. It does not tell you what. So the next layer is laboratory capacity. You need clinics that can collect specimens correctly. You need local labs that can flag unusual results. You need reference labs that can confirm. You need high-containment national labs that can handle the most dangerous work. In the United States, networks like the Laboratory Response Network were built for this purpose, a tiered structure where a suspicious sample can move upward to more specialized capability. This sounds neat on paper. In reality, it is held together by staffing, training, supply chains, and trust. A lab network fails if rural clinics cannot ship samples quickly. It fails if reagents run short. It fails if reporting systems are clumsy. It fails if local authorities fear economic fallout and delay disclosure. Because outbreak response is not only medical, it is political. After the anthrax mailings in the early 2000s, the United States also invested in air monitoring systems, machines that sample air in major cities looking for certain biological signatures. Programs like these promised early warning, but they also exposed a common weakness of technological reassurance: false alarms, slow turnaround, and high cost. An air monitor may detect something, but confirmation still takes time, and time is what panic eats. The most reliable early warning remains the thing nobody loves to fund: public health workforce. Epidemiologists who can interview patients and trace contacts. Field teams who can investigate clusters. Data analysts who can model spread. Communications staff who can speak honestly without lighting fires. The people who do this work are not decorative. They are the system. Detection, however, is only the first fight. The next fight is naming, diagnosis, and identification. Old methods relied on culturing organisms, which is slow. Modern methods rely heavily on molecular tools. Polymerase chain reaction tests to detect genetic material, and increasingly sequencing to read a pathogen's genome. Sequencing changed the game in two ways. First, it helps track spread. If you can see how a pathogen mutates, you can see chains of transmission. You can watch variants appear. You can map outbreak dynamics in near real time. Second, it can support attribution. And attribution is where biology becomes especially treacherous. Because in a fire, you can often find the match. In biology, the match can be a naturally occurring organism that exists in many places. The signature might not be unique. A strain might be common in labs. Contamination is always possible. Chain of custody matters. Sampling conditions matter. The politics around who collected the sample matter. Even in the anthrax investigation in the United States, genetics played a major role, but the scientific and legal debates around that evidence were intense. Genomic fingerprints can help narrow sources, but they rarely speak alone. Good attribution requires a mosaic: genetics, lab records, personnel access, procurement trails, communications, and motive. Without the non-biological evidence, the science can be overinterpreted. So modern response is built around the assumption that biology alone will not hand you certainty. Once you detect and identify, you still have to act. Response is the difference between an outbreak that becomes history and an outbreak that becomes trauma. At the national level, response usually involves incident command structures, clear chains of decision-making meant to prevent chaos. But command structures only work if authorities coordinate across agencies, and in biological events, you often have competing jurisdictions: public health, hospitals, emergency management, law enforcement, sometimes military units. If you cannot coordinate, you lose time. If you lose time, the pathogen wins. Then there are countermeasures. For bacterial threats, antibiotics remain central, but they rely on rapid distribution and on the organism being susceptible. For certain toxins, antitoxins matter. For viral threats, antivirals and monoclonal antibodies can help, but they require manufacturing capacity and prioritization decisions. And vaccines. Vaccines are the hinge. The world learned after the anthrax mailings that having a vaccine somewhere is not the same as being able to deploy it. Stockpiles must be maintained, doses must be allocated, cold storage must exist, trained vaccinators must be available, the public must accept the vaccine. In a crisis, everything becomes logistics, and logistics becomes ethics. Who gets protection first? Healthcare workers, children, older adults, essential workers? The answers depend on values and on strategy, and if you do not decide these frameworks before an emergency, you will decide them during panic, which is the worst time to invent morality. Communication is another countermeasure, and one that is easier to destroy than to build. In biological crises, uncertainty is unavoidable in the early days. Authorities must speak without pretending to know what they do not know. If they perform certainty and later correct themselves, the public hears lie. If they speak only in hedged language, the public hears incompetence. The skill is to be honest, clear, and steady. In the digital age, misinformation spreads like an opportunistic infection. Countering it is not just fact-checking, it is narrative discipline. It is consistency. It is treating the public like adults. Panic loves a vacuum, and social media fills vacuums fast. One of the more practical modern tools that grew into prominence is the One Health approach. The recognition that human, animal, and environmental health are linked. Many human pathogens spill over from animals, so surveillance in livestock and wildlife matters. Veterinary lab networks matter. Environmental monitoring matters. Wastewater surveillance became a particularly important tool during the recent pandemic years. It offers an anonymous, community-level early warning that sickness is rising before hospitals fill. It does not tell you who is sick, but it tells you that sickness is moving. All of these systems, clinical eyes, lab networks, sequencing, stockpiles, communication, are meant to do one thing: shorten the time between the first case and the first organized response. Because time is the true currency of outbreaks. Now here is the bitter part. Preparedness is expensive, and its success looks like nothing happened. A funded epidemiology workforce looks like idle salaries until the day it does not. A stocked warehouse looks like wasted money until the day it saves lives. Training drills look like theater until the day they become muscle memory. This is why governments surge funding after crises and then let it decay. The public gets tired. Politicians chase other headlines, and the cycle repeats. So the history of biological threats is also a history of societal attention span. And under all of it is the fact we keep circling. Prevention through law and treaties is necessary but not sufficient. You need resilience. You need the capacity to absorb a blow, natural, accidental, or deliberate, without collapsing into chaos. In Part 8, we move into the hardest section for anyone who wants tidy endings: attribution and proof. How do you determine whether an outbreak was natural or deliberate? How do you build a case that can stand in court, in diplomacy, and in public opinion? Why is this so much harder than people think? And what happens when states use accusation itself as a weapon? From the Forbidden Dispensary, this is the quiet truth. The most advanced lab on Earth cannot save you if the system around it is brittle. Preparedness is not brilliance, it is durability. That's Part 8. Attribution in biological events is where two kinds of knowledge meet and glare at each other across the same table. One kind is slow, patient, clinical, epidemiology. It watches patterns, traces exposure, measures incubation, maps the spread the way an older generation mapped rivers. The other kind is sharp-edged and secretive, intelligence and law enforcement. It watches people, motives, money, travel, communications, procurement, access. It wants names. It wants chains of command. It wants something you can put in handcuffs or sanction with a signature. Both are necessary. Neither is enough alone. Epidemiology can tell you whether the spread looks explosive, whether it clusters around a point source, whether it follows known seasonal rhythms or behaves like something introduced. It can tell you whether cases line up downwind of a facility, whether a hospital is seeing a pattern that should not exist. But epidemiology cannot read intent off a fever chart. Forensics can read genomes, compare strains, look for unusual features. It can examine spore preparations, additives, particle sizes, the kinds of technical fingerprints that suggest a lab-made product rather than an accidental one. But forensics alone cannot tell you who had the idea, who opened the door, who carried it, who ordered it, who funded it. So attribution becomes a mosaic, assembled from many tiles, any one of which can crack under pressure. And pressure is always present, because a biological incident is never just a medical event. It is a political event. Even before the facts are stable, leaders feel compelled to speak. Populations demand reassurance. Markets react. Rival states watch for weakness. The public wants certainty before certainty exists. This is where mistakes happen. Consider what an investigation must do in real time. First, distinguish natural from deliberate. That sounds straightforward until you look at reality. Many dangerous pathogens exist naturally. Outbreaks can begin in ways that look suspicious. A cluster near a lab can be coincidence. A sudden spike can be a super-spreading event. A pattern that seems unnatural can be explained by human behavior, crowding, travel, workplace exposures. So investigators look for anomalies that pile up. Is the strain unusual for the region? Are multiple, separated clusters appearing without a clear natural link? Is there evidence of a point source release? Are victims connected through shared exposure to a location or product? Does the clinical presentation match known natural patterns? Then, preserve evidence. This is harder than most people imagine. Biological evidence degrades. Samples can be contaminated. Chain of custody can be challenged. If your samples were collected by a party with a stake in the outcome, trust collapses. The integrity of the investigation depends on procedures that sound boring, but decide credibility. Standardized sampling, documentation, secure transport, independent lab confirmation, and careful record-keeping. Then, interpret the science without overselling it. This is another trap. Genomic tools are powerful, but they are not magic. A pathogen genome can indicate relatedness to known samples. It can narrow likely sources. It can sometimes show signs of manipulation, though even that can be ambiguous because natural evolution can mimic certain changes. And many laboratories around the world may share common strains for legitimate research. The same organism can exist in multiple places, so a match is not always a smoking gun. Finally, tie the biology to human action. That means access logs, procurement records, lab notebooks, travel histories, communications, and motive. In a criminal case, you also need a standard of proof that can stand in court, not just in a briefing room. This is why biological attribution is so often contested, even when people are convinced they know what happened. History gives us a few stark reminders. In the Soviet anthrax incident in Sverdlovsk, the government insisted contaminated meat was the cause. But maps of cases told a different story. A plume pattern consistent with airborne release from a military facility. Years later, admissions and additional evidence aligned with the accident explanation. That case matters because it shows how a state can shape a narrative to protect secrecy, and how stubborn data can eventually erode that narrative. Then there is the opposite danger, when political hunger for a narrative outruns the evidence. In the run-up to the invasion of Iraq, claims about weapons programs, including biological capabilities, were presented with confidence that was later revealed to be misplaced or unsupported. Intelligence can be wrong, sources can lie, analysts can be pressured, leaders can cherry-pick. When uncertainty is converted into certainty for political ends, the result is not simply an error. It can be catastrophe. So attribution is not just a technical challenge, it is a governance challenge. The ability of institutions to tolerate uncertainty without manufacturing conclusions. Internationally, the structure is still imperfect. The Biological Weapons Convention is a norm-building instrument, but it lacks an enforcement body with routine inspection powers. There is no standing equivalent to the Chemical Weapons Inspectorate that can deploy with clear authority, take samples, and issue findings with broad acceptance. The United Nations has mechanisms that can be used to investigate alleged biological weapon use, but they are invoked rarely and always under political strain. The request to investigate can be framed as an accusation, and accusation triggers defensive behavior, especially among states with secrets. Verification in biology, as we have said, is difficult because of dual use. A vaccine facility can look like a weapons facility from certain angles. A high-containment lab can be legitimate. It can also hide other work. The same equipment serves multiple ends. So states fall back on confidence-building measures, voluntary declarations, information exchanges, invitations for visits. These can help, but they are not inspections in the hard sense. They coax, they do not compel. And then there is the issue of legal standards. In domestic courts, prosecutors must prove guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. In international politics, there is no single standard. States may act on high-confidence intelligence without revealing the underlying evidence. That secrecy may protect sources, but it also weakens public credibility and invites counterclaims. Biology is especially fertile ground for counterclaims because evidence is complex and technical complexity is easy to exploit in propaganda. This is why, when the world talks about making attribution more credible, the answer is not only better sequencing, it is better institutions. It is the creation of investigative capabilities that are internationally trusted, technically rigorous, and procedurally protected against tampering. Teams that can deploy quickly. Labs that are accredited and independent. Methods that are transparent enough to be evaluated by outside experts, even if some sensitive details remain classified. The goal is not perfect certainty. The goal is credible conclusions that can withstand scrutiny. And there is another dimension here: justice. Naming an attacker matters, but it is not the same as holding them accountable. Accountability depends on courts, tribunals, sanctions, or in some cases, truth commissions and reparations. And history shows accountability is uneven. Some crimes are prosecuted loudly, others are buried under geopolitical bargains. Unit 731 is the most infamous example. Some perpetrators were tried, others shielded, because their data were considered valuable. That bargain did not only injure survivors, it taught future planners a dangerous lesson. Knowledge can buy immunity. So prevention is not only about fences and laws, it is about making sure the world does not reward the worst behavior with silence and benefits. The last piece of attribution is the one nobody likes to discuss. The last piece of attribution is the one nobody likes to discuss because it feels too human, too messy, too impolite for policy language. Blame. When people are frightened, they demand a culprit. They want a face. They want a reason the universe makes sense. And if a government cannot provide that face quickly and convincingly, the public will invent one. Rival states will invent one. Social media will mass-produce them like counterfeit bills. So the question is not whether blame will appear. The question is whether institutions can hold it back long enough for evidence to catch up. That is why attribution is not merely a scientific undertaking. It is a political discipline. It requires leaders who can tolerate ambiguity without turning it into certainty for convenience. It requires agencies that can resist pressure to solve a case before it can honestly be solved. It requires journalists and citizens who can live with provisional answers without demanding blood in the comment section. History does not give us much comfort here. It gives us warnings. Because accusation itself can be used as a weapon. During wars, states have thrown biological allegations like grenades, sometimes based on real evidence, sometimes as propaganda designed to harden alliances, justify escalation, or paint an enemy as beyond the pale. When proof is partial, when access is denied, when investigations are politicized, narratives multiply. And once narratives multiply, truth becomes another casualty. This is why the idea of a credible, internationally trusted investigative capability matters so much. Not because it would end disagreement, nothing ends disagreement, but because it would raise the cost of lying. A world where a neutral, procedurally rigorous team can collect samples, preserve chain of custody, analyze in accredited labs, and publish findings with clear confidence levels would not eliminate propaganda, but it would give the world an anchor. Right now, that anchor is too light. The Biological Weapons Convention remains a moral architecture more than a policing one. It can convene meetings, it can set norms, it can pressure diplomatically, but it lacks a standing verification and inspection body with teeth. So much of the work falls to ad hoc mechanisms, special UN investigations, national intelligence assessments, allied coordination. These can be effective, but they are vulnerable to skepticism, especially when evidence is classified and conclusions are announced like verdicts without showing the jury the case. And there is another hard truth. Even the best attribution does not automatically produce justice. Justice requires leverage. Legal, political, economic. It requires arrests or sanctions or extraditions. It requires international cooperation. It requires the perpetrator to be identifiable in a way that can be proved. And it requires the world to care enough to act. This is why some crimes produce tribunals and others produce silence. And silence, too, is a kind of policy. So prevention is not only about stopping an attack, it is about shaping the world so that an attack is a losing proposition, politically, materially, morally. That means building norms so strong that a state using disease risks becoming a pariah. It means building investigative capacity so secrecy is less reliable. It means building public health resilience so the strategic value of an attack is reduced. And it means doing something that sounds soft but matters more than most people admit: preserving memory. Because memory is a deterrent of its own kind. Not perfect, not absolute, but real. When atrocities are denied, minimized, or treated as footnotes, the lesson learned by opportunists is that they might get away with it. When atrocities are named, documented, taught, and held in the public record, the lesson becomes heavier. This is why archives matter, survivor testimony matters, museums matter, declassification matters, court transcripts matter, the slow work of historians matters, not because history is a courtroom that always convicts, but because history is one of the few places secrecy can lose, eventually. And that brings us to prevention in the modern world, which is not a single program, but a layered approach, some hard, some soft, all necessary. First layer, international norms and law. The Biological Weapons Convention should be strengthened, not weakened. Even without perfect verification, the treaty establishes a categorical prohibition that shapes behavior and enables diplomatic consequences. It is a moral line that most states do not want to be seen crossing. But norms alone are not vaccines. So the second layer is verification and transparency measures, imperfect as they are. Confidence-building measures, voluntary facility declarations, scientific exchanges, invitations for visits. These are not thrilling, but they can raise trust incrementally and make cheating harder. Third layer, export controls and industry screening. Groups like the Australia Group coordinate controls on sensitive materials and equipment. Gene synthesis companies screen orders for sequences associated with regulated pathogens. These measures are not airtight, but they can slow and complicate misuse. Fourth layer, biosafety and biosecurity culture. This is where governance becomes human again. Labs must be run safely, inventory must be controlled, access must be limited, reporting of accidents must be encouraged, not punished into silence. Training must include ethical history, not just techniques. A scientist should graduate knowing not only what they can do, but what has been done before in the name of necessity. Fifth layer, public health resilience. This is the layer that matters no matter what the source of harm is. Natural outbreak, lab accident, deliberate release. Surveillance systems, lab networks, stockpiles, rapid diagnostics, platform vaccine technologies, surge staffing, hospital preparedness, clear communication plans. When these systems are strong, the strategic payoff of biological harm declines. Because an attacker wants panic, overload, and collapse, resilience denies them that. Sixth layer, rapid, credible investigation capacity, not just for punishment, but for clarity. In an uncertain event, clarity prevents escalation based on rumor. It also prevents governments from using a crisis as an excuse to settle unrelated scores. All of these layers together are how modern societies try to live in a world where biology is powerful, ubiquitous, and increasingly editable. But there is still one more thread in this history we haven't pulled tight yet: the paradox at the center of the entire arc. The same connectivity that made global trade and modern medicine possible also made global outbreaks inevitable. The same scientific advances that created vaccines also created the knowledge that could be misused. The same openness that fuels public health also fuels risk. So the question is not, can we return to a simpler world? We cannot. The question is, can we build a world sturdy enough to survive what we have learned? In Part 10, we will close in on that paradox and the modern reality of dual use at scale, how platform technologies, rapid sequencing, and global supply chains alter both risk and defense. We will also talk about why cheap biological harm often looks like disruption rather than apocalypse, and why that matters for what societies choose to protect first. From the Forbidden Dispensary, this is the uneasy instruction. The best defense against biological warfare is not only fear of it, it is investment in the boring architecture of health, transparency, and accountability. That's Part 10. There is a paradox sitting at the center of this entire history, and it refuses to be talked down. The same world that makes biological harm more plausible also makes biological defense more powerful. The same tools that shorten the distance from idea to organism also shorten the distance from sequence to countermeasure. The same connectivity that lets disease travel fast also lets information travel faster, if, and this is the crucial if, institutions choose openness over denial. Modern biology has made two things simultaneously true. First, capability is spreading. Second, response can be faster than it has ever been. This is why the old Cold War image, two superpowers with secret labs, no longer captures the full shape of risk. Today, life science capability is distributed across universities, private companies, hospitals, contract research organizations, and national laboratories across many countries. Manufacturing capacity is global. Supply chains cross borders. Data moves through clouds and servers and shared databases. That is mostly good. It means more people can develop vaccines, diagnostics, therapies, and surveillance tools. It means disease can be identified quickly and tracked with precision. It means platform technologies can be adapted fast. But it also means that the number of places where dangerous work might happen, by accident, negligence, or malice, has grown. Not because most people are bad, but because systems become more complex as they scale, and complexity creates more points of failure. You can see this in the way modern preparedness has shifted toward platforms. A platform is not a single vaccine. It is a method that can produce many vaccines quickly once you have the sequence. Messenger RNA approaches are one example. Viral vectors are another. Recombinant protein methods. The promise is speed, a faster turn from detection to product. Speed reduces vulnerability, but speed does not solve distribution. It does not solve manufacturing bottlenecks. It does not solve cold storage requirements. It does not solve political hoarding. It does not solve public distrust. It does not solve the fact that some countries have robust systems and others do not. So even as technology advances, the old truth remains. Response is an ethical and logistical project, not only a scientific one. And that matters because biological harm, deliberate or accidental, does not need to be apocalyptic to be strategic. One of the quiet lessons threaded through all the modern cases is that cheap biological harm often aims at disruption, not annihilation. Think of the Oregon salmonella attack. The goal was to make enough people ill to change an election, not to end the world. Think of the anthrax letters. The number of cases was small compared to what people imagine when they hear the word bioweapon. But the societal reverberation was huge. Postal systems disrupted, buildings shut down, fear injected into daily routines, enormous investigative cost, long-term mistrust. Disruption is attractive because it is easier to achieve, and because modern societies run on tight coupling, just-in-time supply chains, dense urban life, shared infrastructure. Disruption hits harder than people expect. A small amount of biological trouble can create a large amount of social and economic shock. That is why modern resilience planning increasingly focuses on the essentials. Hospitals that can surge, labs that can test rapidly at scale, supply chains for protective gear, reagents and medications that do not collapse instantly under global demand. Clear legal authorities for emergency measures that do not turn into permanent overreach. Communication capacity that does not lie to the public in the name of calm, because lies rot credibility, and credibility is the real currency of compliance. Workforce pipelines that keep public health staffed between crises, not only during them. And because we live in a world where animal and environmental health are tied to human health, resilience also includes veterinary surveillance, wildlife monitoring, and environmental sampling. All of this is a defense against nature as much as against malice. That is the point that is often missed when politicians talk about bioweapons as if they are a special category of apocalypse. Preparedness for deliberate events and preparedness for natural outbreaks are largely the same investments. A well-run surveillance and response system does not care whether the spark was intentional. It cares about stopping the fire. Now, here is the part that makes strategists uncomfortable. Prevention through secrecy is limited. The instinct of many security institutions is to classify, compartmentalize, and hide. Sometimes secrecy is necessary, particularly around details that could enable direct harm. But excessive secrecy undermines preparedness in two ways. First, it slows information sharing and early detection. Outbreaks get buried, data gets delayed, signals get muffled. Second, it corrodes trust. When the public learns later that it was misled, every future emergency becomes harder. People assume the next instruction is also a manipulation. So modern resilience requires a kind of disciplined transparency. Share what must be shared to protect people. Protect what must be protected to avoid giving a recipe to someone who wants to hurt others. That balancing act is not neat. It never will be. It requires institutions with credibility, and credibility is built by long habits of honesty. This is why the most important technology in biological security is not a machine. It is governance. It is the ability to coordinate across agencies, across borders, across political lines. It is the ability to fund public health when headlines fade. It is the ability to investigate incidents without turning them instantly into propaganda. It is the ability to admit uncertainty without collapsing into paralysis. And it is the ability to learn. Because every crisis teaches lessons, and those lessons must be turned into durable change rather than temporary theater. We have talked about the rise of knowledge. We have talked about state programs and non-state actors. We have talked about detection, attribution, and the fragile politics of blame. What remains now is the closing movement. What all of this adds up to, morally and practically. In Part 11, we return to the long arc and ask what the history is actually saying about human nature, about convenience, about the temptation to turn suffering into strategy. We will also talk about the uncomfortable continuity, the way the same logic appears again and again, from sieges to laboratories. From the Forbidden Dispensary, this is the modern instruction. You cannot regulate biology into harmlessness. You can only build systems strong enough that harm, when it comes, does not get to rule your society. That's Part 11. If you strip away the centuries, the changing uniforms, the evolving vocabulary, the improved instruments, what remains is not a story about microbes. It is a story about convenience. War has always been a marketplace of shortcuts. Leaders look for the cheapest lever that can move the enemy. Disease has been one of the oldest levers because it is already present, already hungry, already indifferent to who deserves what. The earliest commanders did not need germ theory to understand a simple pattern. Crowd people together, cut off clean water, force them to live in waste and fear, and sickness will do the rest. When the wall held, the well became the battlefield. When stones could not break morale, rot could. That is where this began. Siege logic. Not glamorous, not cinematic. Just patient pressure until bodies fail. Then came the medieval hinge, Caffa, the story of corpses thrown over walls. Whether or not that act truly drove the great pandemic westward, the image endured because it offers the thing people crave in catastrophe: agency. A human hand to blame, a deliberate act to point at, and the desire for that hand, to find someone who did it, never left. Atlantic conquest brought a different horror: disease as inadvertent ally. Most of the microbial devastation in the Americas was not aimed like an arrow. It arrived with ships, with trade, with movement. But policy choices turned accident into a weapon anyway. Through forced relocations, labor exploitation, and the creation of crowded conditions where sickness spread more efficiently. Then at Fort Pitt, intention stepped into the record plainly. Infected items contemplated and distributed, discussed in correspondence as if infection were a routine option, not a cosmic tragedy, but a tactic. From there, science sharpened the blade. Germ theory did not invent cruelty, but it gave cruelty a manual. It taught states how to cultivate what they had once only endured. It turned outbreaks into systems knowledge. In the 20th century, that knowledge met industrial capacity. The result was not merely research, but programs, sabotage, production, and in the worst case, Unit 731, where the language of public health became a mask for atrocity and living people became experimental surfaces. Then the Cold War expanded the same logic. Secrecy, deterrence, dual use, and the enduring problem that biology cannot be easily verified from the outside. Sverdlovsk showed that accidents happen, that weapons programs wound their owners, and that official narratives can lie for years until the facts force themselves out. And when the age of states began to share the stage with the age of non-state actors, the story did not become less frightening. It became more intimate. Oregon salad bars, Tokyo subways, American mail, not extinction-level events, disruption events. And disruption, in a tightly coupled modern society, can be strategically decisive. So what does this add up to? It adds up to continuity. The ancient commander fouling a well and the modern bureaucrat approving a budget for defensive research share the same underlying temptation: to treat the body as terrain, to treat illness as a tool, to see suffering as an acceptable cost for advantage. This is why the history is not primarily a technical chronology. The tools change, the moral pressure stays, and there is an irony sharp enough to cut. The same mobility that made empire profitable, ships, caravans, railways, aircraft, also made pandemics inevitable. The same global networks that deliver medicine also deliver contagion. Trade and conquest knit the world together, and the stitching brought both wealth and vulnerability. So when we talk about biological warfare, we are never talking only about a weapon. We are talking about the world that makes the weapon thinkable. That world includes dense populations and fragile infrastructure, systems that depend on trust and routine, inequity that makes some communities more vulnerable than others, scientific capability that can be turned toward healing or harm, political institutions that may choose transparency or concealment. And what does history instruct? It does not give comfort, it gives demands. First, do not romanticize the tactic. Even when it feels like cleverness, hurling filth, distributing infected items, contaminating a supply, the outcomes are never clean. The consequences spill. Innocent people absorb them first. The enemy becomes a category that includes children, workers, the elderly, the people who never held a weapon. Second, do not mistake treaties for immunity. The Geneva Protocol and the Biological Weapons Convention matter. They establish norms. They create political consequences. They shape what most states will not openly admit to doing. But law without verification and culture without enforcement is not enough. Treaties must be paired with transparency practices, investigative capacity, and real investment in public health. Third, build resilience where it counts, not only in secret programs, not only in intelligence agencies, in hospitals, in labs, in local health departments, in supply chains, in communications capacity, in workforce training, in international cooperation that treats outbreak reporting as a duty, not as a public relations decision. Because the best defense against biological harm, natural or deliberate, is the same thing. A society that can see early, act fast, and stay coherent under stress. Fourth, protect legitimacy. A frightened public will accept extraordinary measures only if it believes the institutions imposing those measures are honest and accountable. Secrecy that is used to avoid embarrassment is self-sabotage. It creates the very mistrust that makes future response impossible. Fifth, remember, this is where my voice, speaking as the Forbidden Dispensary, becomes less narrator and more witness. Memory is not a luxury. It is part of defense. It is what prevents repetition from feeling like novelty. When Unit 731 is minimized, the world learns the wrong lesson. When Fort Pitt is treated as a footnote, the world learns the wrong lesson. When Sverdlovsk is brushed away, the world learns the wrong lesson. Remembering does not mean living in paranoia. It means refusing to let convenience erase consequence. And if you are looking for the thread that ties this all together, it is this. Weaponizing disease is rarely a leap of genius. It is usually a step of indifference. A moment where someone decides the suffering of others is acceptable. The science can make it possible, only the moral decision makes it real. So we come to the end of the long night. One part remains, part 12, where we close the ledger, not with comfort, but with clarity. What a society can reasonably do, what it must refuse, and what it should invest in if it wants to live in a world where biology is powerful and the human imagination is not always kind. From the Forbidden Dispensary, this is the penultimate truth. The most dangerous pathogen in the story is not a bacterium. It is the willingness to treat life as disposable. That's part 12. Here is what I can sell you at the Forbidden Dispensary that no jar, no tincture, no smoke, no pill can deliver. A clear look at what this history demands of the living. Because the story we walked through, sieges and wells, ships and trade routes, forts and blankets, laboratories and treaties, cults and mailrooms, does not end with a moral bow tied neatly around it. It ends the way most true histories end, with the burden handed forward. The question is not whether disease can be weaponized. It can. The question is what kind of world makes weaponizing disease a bad bet? And that is a practical question, not a poetic one. If you want to reduce biological warfare, you do not start by pretending you can purge the knowledge from the world. You cannot. The tools are here. The techniques are taught. The equipment is widespread. Biology is not rare like fissile material. It is ordinary life turned dangerous by intent. So you build friction against misuse. You build speed into response. You build honesty into institutions. That is the only real playbook. First, make outbreaks visible faster than rumor can rewrite them. Early detection is not glamorous, but it is decisive. A society with strong clinical surveillance, well-funded local health departments, competent laboratories, and easy reporting systems shortens the window where a deliberate act can hide inside. Maybe it's just flu. That means investing in trained epidemiologists and laboratorians, routine data sharing between clinics and public health, reliable supply chains for tests and protective equipment, rapid sequencing capacity paired with skilled interpretation, international reporting norms that are treated as duty, not as embarrassment. A pathogen thrives in delay. Delay is often political. So the first defense is removing incentives to hide. Second, Build response capacity that does not improvise morality during panic. The moment sickness spreads, societies face questions that feel cruel because they are scarce resource questions. Who gets medicine? Who gets a bed? Who gets protection first? If you wait until the emergency, you will decide under pressure, and every decision will look like favoritism or negligence. So ethical frameworks have to be debated and written before crisis, in daylight, while people can still listen. Preparedness means stockpiles with real distribution plans, not just warehouses, hospital surge plans that include staffing, not only equipment, legal authorities for isolation and quarantine that include limits and oversight, clear triggers for escalation and de-escalation, communication plans that commit to transparency about uncertainty. A society that stays coherent under stress denies an attacker the main reward: chaos. Third, treat biosafety and biosecurity as culture, not compliance theater. In every era, humans have tried to keep secrets in rooms that were too small for the consequences. The modern version is the laboratory that handles dangerous organisms while assuming procedures are enough. Procedures are not enough. You need a culture where people report near misses without being punished into silence, where safety officers have authority, where oversight is independent, where inventory control is real, where training includes history and ethics, not only technique, because lab accidents are not only possible, they are inevitable across time if systems scale without humility. Fourth, strengthen investigation and attribution so accusation cannot run wild. A biological incident creates pressure to name a culprit. Without credible investigation, the world will substitute suspicion, and suspicion can start wars, ruin lives, and fracture alliances. So the goal is not perfect certainty, the goal is credible, internationally respected fact-finding, procedures that preserve chain of custody, analysis in accredited labs, transparent confidence levels, and a public account that can withstand scrutiny. Right now, the world's mechanisms are uneven. They rely too much on ad hoc efforts and too much on national intelligence claims that the public cannot examine. That leaves room for propaganda and for reckless political use of confidence. If the world is serious, it will invest in independent investigative capacity that is fast, technical, and procedurally protected. Fifth, do not reward atrocity with utility. This is the moral scar that refuses to heal. When perpetrators escape because their data are valuable, when crimes are minimized because prosecutions are inconvenient, when victims are told to accept silence in the name of national interest. Unit 731 is the warning here, not only for what it did, but for what happened afterward. If you let knowledge purchase immunity, you teach the next generation of opportunists that cruelty has a market. So accountability matters, not only for justice, but for deterrence. Trials, sanctions, reparations where possible, and the preservation of evidence so denial cannot become official truth. Sixth, keep the public on your side by refusing to lie to them. This might be the most practical lesson of all. Biological events require public cooperation. People must accept guidance. They must seek testing. They must take vaccines or medication. They must isolate when needed. None of that works if they believe the institutions speaking to them are using them. In this domain, trust is not a public relations accessory. It is a life-saving asset. And trust is built through habits. Admitting uncertainty early, correcting mistakes openly, explaining trade-offs clearly, separating science communication from political theater, protecting whistleblowers and independent oversight. A government that lies to prevent panic often manufactures panic later when the lie is exposed. Seventh, remember that the cheapest biological weapon is not a superbug. It is disruption, a contaminated food source, a compromised water system, a targeted release that creates fear out of proportion to its scale, an insider with access, a small act that forces expensive response. That means critical infrastructure protection matters. Food safety, water systems, hospital infection control, supply chain resilience, and routine public health enforcement that never makes headlines. The boring is where societies live or die. So this is the ledger at the end of the night. Not a comforting conclusion, but an honest one. Biology will always be capable of harm because it is part of life, and life is everywhere. The only thing that changes the danger level is human choice. Policy choices, funding choices, ethical choices, and the daily decision to build institutions that tell the truth and do the slow work. From the Forbidden Dispensary, I'll leave you with the final sentence I think this history deserves. The weapon is not the pathogen. The weapon is the decision to treat other people's bodies as acceptable terrain. Good night.